Thank you very much to everyone for coming this evening. It's great to have such a good turnout after what I understand was a very engaging day with the Bicycle Network's forum throughout the day. My name's Jess Feehely. I'm a member of Climate Tasmania, the host for this evening, host's organisation for this evening. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, the Moanina people. I think particularly when we're talking about the integration of sustainable transport and transport planning, it behoves us to remember that if we'd done that better, perhaps we wouldn't have built a bypass over a significant cultural heritage site. But I digress. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of some elected representatives here today. So Richard Atkinson I've seen and Anna Reynolds, and welcome to anyone else who I haven't clocked. There are also representatives from a number of organisations, Planning Institute, Australian Electric Vehicle Association and the Tasmanian Climate Change Office who are here with us. So thank you very much for all being here. Climate Tas, as you might have seen from the pictures that were up here before, is quite a diverse organisation, lots of varied interests and expertise, but our overall aim is to ensure that decision making is informed by all of the interests and expertise that we have, and aiming for a more sustainable climate and a better planet. Transport is incredibly important in that mix and often neglected, particularly in Tasmania. It's often misunderstood that, in fact, transport is the largest contributor to our energy sector emissions and has in fact grown 8% since the 1990 threshold against which we measure. So it's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed, and reducing emissions aren't the only goal of better transport. We're going to hear today lots of reasons why better transport planning actually makes for better places to live. So we're really pleased to have two great speakers to look at that topic tonight. The event's going to run, we'll hear from both Elliot and Jason, and then we'll take some questions. So there won't be questions at the end of each presentation. We'll do a joint Q&A session at the end of the two presentations. And then I'll hand over to my colleague, Climate Tas colleague Peter Boyer, to just do a bit of a wrap up on what we've heard and where to next. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Dr. Elliot Fishman is a director of the Institute for Sensible Transport. He's worked in transport innovation and sustainable mobility for over a decade, specialising in shared transport, disruptive transport innovation and sustainable transport policy, and has recently led an investigation of transport innovations in the Netherlands. So if you could join me in welcoming Elliot Fishman.
Hey, thank you very much, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And it's really great to have such an awesome turnout on a dark winter's night in Hobart. So I think that goes to show just how much people care about this issue. It's also probably important to mention right at the beginning that I'm not from Hobart. I don't know Hobart's transport system intimately, so a lot of the observations and comments that I'll be making aren't necessarily focused entirely on Hobart or underpinned by a deep knowledge of transport in Hobart or Tasmania in general. So bear with me. So I want to start with conclusions because it's getting a little bit late at night, and if your mind wanders, at least get the important stuff done in advance. So, and also apologies in advance to those of you that were in an earlier presentation that I gave this afternoon. There aren't too many duplicate slides, but there might be some. So if you see them, sorry. So I think an important first question that you should ask, even before we start getting down to the sorts of transport, or the sorts of public transport, or the routes in which they might operate, or the corridors in which they might operate, before we get started with any of that, and not that we are going to get down to that level of detail this evening, or at least not in my presentation, I think it's important to take a step back and think about what sort of city would you want Hobart to be in 2040 or 2050? What sort of city would you want your children or grandchildren to grow up in? How would you want those streets to feel like, and how would you like to be able to travel, and how would you like your children and grandchildren to be able to travel in this future city? And then once you have an idea of what that city might look like, thinking about what sort of steps we might take now as a community, and also for government, what sort of steps would we take now in order to move us closer to that end goal, or that vision of what we want our future city to look like. Some people say that we don't really have transport planning in Australia, we really have transport reacting. And transport reacting on a very short-term basis doesn't really get us anywhere, and in many cases it can exacerbate problems rather than solve them. I think another theme of the work that I've been involved with over the last few years is the idea of doing more with less. So using less resources, less emissions, less space, less household income involved in paying for transport. So doing more with less is something that as our cities get larger in terms of population, and when a city's population increases without a consequent increase in the geographical size of that city, that means there's less space per person. And when there's less space per person, we need to start thinking more about more space-efficient modes of transport. And as you'll see in some of the slides that I'll show you tonight, we're often very dependent on the least space-efficient mode of transport. And so in our future city for 2050 or 2060, we need to think about how we might be able to change that. And solving congestion really isn't possible. No one's really done it successfully and created a city that people want to be in. And so we should just stop trying. Stop trying to solve congestion, because you can't really solve it. The space required for a car is insatiable, and whatever additional road volume you provide will simply be taken up by additional cars on that road. So you're not going to solve congestion, so don't bother spending billions of dollars trying. And really, the best transport strategy is a good land use strategy. And as mentioned in the introduction, I was in the Netherlands over the last 2 weeks leading a study tour for elected officials and senior transport planners to learn a little bit about how the Dutch have managed to create the sort of transport system that they've got. And one of the key themes that came out of that, one of the themes that emerged constantly from the speakers that we had during that study tour, was land use strategy. They banned big box outer suburban stores in Amsterdam, and they created a requirement to have small-scale supermarkets and other stores in the centre of the city and in the middle band suburbs, so that no one's ever too far away, no one's ever more than a walk or a short cycle away from the stores that they need. And that creates a situation in which you don't need to burn a litre of petrol to get a litre of milk, which is often what might happen in outer suburban Australian cities. And I'm also going to talk tonight about why we need to think about changing the way we pay for transport. And essentially what I'm talking about there is a road user charge that does away with the fixed costs of car registration, because if you register a car and you drive 10,000 kilometres a year, you pay the same amount as someone that drives 40,000 kilometres a year at peak hour. So if we can create a system where the more you drive, the more you pay, and the less you drive, the less you pay, that will create the pricing signals to encourage a much more efficient use of the car. So it's not saying no more cars, can't have cars anymore. It's saying we need to create a set of pricing signals that encourages smarter use of the car. So, because this is Climate Tasmania, I thought it might be nice to start off with a slide that really just talks about, if we're looking to reduce the emissions from the transport system, there are really 4 pathways that you can go about doing that. So you can get fuel efficiency, so a move towards smaller, more fuel efficient cars and electric vehicles. And I know that in Tasmania there's a strong move towards electrification of the vehicle fleet, partly because of the relatively green production of electricity here in Tasmania versus some other states on the mainland. You can also look at mode change, so that's shifting from the car to a more efficient mode. So moving from a car to an e-bike, for instance, would be an example of that. You can also decrease VKT, so that's vehicle kilometres travelled, for those of you that aren't transport planners in the audience. Without mode change, that's people making shorter trips, so going to a shorter destination rather than one further away. And you can also avoid trips, so there might be instances where people are making trips that are unnecessary, where you could do trip training, or you could choose to work from home 1 day a week and reduce the amount of kilometres that you travel by 20%. So there are the spectrum of views. Now, some people might say they might prefer one of those options versus the other, and I'm not necessarily saying that there's a better one or a worse one, but these are just the spectrum of opportunities that you have for reducing emissions from transport. Sorry for not putting Tasmania's figures up here. I only got Melbourne, because I was, well, the last 48 hours I've been in transit back from the Netherlands, and I thought this one wouldn't be too dissimilar. The numbers will be different, but the curves will be basically the same of the billion passenger kilometres that have been taking place. This is in Melbourne, but the shape of that curve will be roughly the same in Tasmania, and passenger cars is by far and away the largest, and that has been the case for a long time. But if we went back, if this graph went back to the mid-1940s or the early 1950s, the car didn't have the huge contribution that it currently has in terms of the number of kilometres that is taken through private motor vehicles. And this, again, sorry for Melbourne, but this is the percentage of the passenger kilometres travelled by different modes. And really the only thing you need to take away from this graph is that the top one is about 85% of all passenger kilometres is by the car. So all I'm saying here really is that we are a very car-dependent country. Yes, we're a big country, but our cities don't span the whole of the country. Our cities are geographically confined, and in many cases people work in the suburb in which they live or an adjoining suburb, or adjoining municipality. So even though Australia's a big country, a lot of our trips to work and to other places aren't necessarily all that long. In terms of cumulatively across Australia, our emissions from transport doesn't look good. We're increasing, not decreasing our emissions, so we're going to need to bring those transport emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, and at the moment the trends are going in the opposite direction. So whatever we're doing at the moment, we can't keep doing, or otherwise we're going to have no chance of meeting the Paris commitment. So it's somewhat disturbing that in most cases both sides of politics in different states are essentially rolling out transport plans worth billions of dollars that, or not even transport plans, just transport projects that serve very little chance of reducing emissions, and in most cases would be much more likely to increase emissions in the long term. It's also, under this theme of doing more with less, it's interesting to look at how many people you can move through a certain roadway over the course of an hour. So that's what this illustration does. So this is a 3.5 metre lane. Over the course of 60 minutes, how many people you can move depending upon what mode of transport those people are in. And what it shows is on the left-hand side, you've got cars with the average vehicle occupancy, which is 1.1 people per vehicle, which is the average in Australia at peak hour. You can move 2,000 people. With cyclists, you can move 7 times as many as that, 14,000. And then as you move more towards the rail options, you get more and more people being able to move over through that 3.5 metre lane over the course of an hour. Now you might argue that maybe that heavy rail figure is wrong and it should be 72,000 or whatever it is. That's not really the point. The point is that at the moment, the bulk of our funding and the bulk of our road space is dedicated to the least space efficient mode of transport, and yet we sit here wondering, why do we have a congestion problem? I think that's why. This image is one that we developed for the City of Melbourne just a few months ago, where they asked us to audit the emissions that occur from transport within the City of Melbourne, so the central city area. And what we've done here is we've looked at different modes of transport, and the black balloons are the emissions, so that's the per person emissions in terms of grams of CO2 for those different modes of transport. Now, so the bigger the balloon, the dirtier it is, basically. It's important also to recognise that for that second mode of transport, which is a top-of-the-range EV, so that's actually a Tesla, but the City of Melbourne asked us not to use the trade name there. We use the Victorian grid electricity because we're in Melbourne. The Victorian grid electricity, of course, is much dirtier than it is here in Tasmania, so this was a key finding. If you've got a dirty grid, an EV isn't all that great, and in fact, it's dirtier to charge, to use a high-end EV in using Victorian grid electricity. It's dirtier than 8 of the top 10 best-selling petrol cars in Australia at the moment. So I think that helped to balance people's views in the City of Melbourne about, well, to what degree should they be rolling out on-road charging infrastructure without thinking about the green grid first. And then as you move towards public transport, it is, as you would expect, you start to get much more efficient. This is per person, so we used average public transport vehicle occupancy to develop these numbers. And walking, cycling clearly don't have any emissions associated with the act of either walking or cycling. And then we've also got these footprints at the bottom there. And they're not carbon footprints, they're the physical footprint, the physical amount of space, so in terms of square metres per occupant. And you can see there that what I think is really interesting at least is that the electric vehicle, of course, even though it's often touted as being the solution to Australia's transport problems, in terms of congestion, it will do nothing because, of course, an electric vehicle takes up the same amount of space as a regular petrol powered. So there is even the possibility that electric vehicles could exacerbate our congestion problems because the per kilometre cost of driving an EV can be less than a petrol powered car, which means that people may drive more regularly or further than they would otherwise. So this is important to keep in mind because we're not just talking about emissions, we're also talking about space. And when we're talking about both those things, then public transport, walking, cycling become the obvious solution. And we also did this exercise where we created some scenarios of given, and this is for Melbourne, but it's relevant to any city that's growing because Melbourne is growing rapidly, and because the Paris Agreement, it's about total emissions, not per person emissions. It means that if you're a growing city, the emissions per person has to reduce even more aggressively than what the total headline figure is in terms of the reduction targets. So if we go through with the business as usual, by 2030, we'll be producing per person 320 kilos of CO2 per year for the city of Melbourne. But if we want to meet our Paris commitment, then we've really only got a carbon budget of 139 kilos of CO2 per person by 2030. So there's a really strong argument now that we need to radically change the way that our streets function in terms of the modes that they support in order to attract people towards the more space and emissions efficient forms of transport. And really, in terms of implementation, in terms of the actions, the things that you would need to do in order to bring about the reduction in carbon emissions that are required under the Paris Agreement in terms of transport, there's road space reallocation. So instead of having 5 lanes of motor vehicle traffic all going in one direction in streets in Hobart, it would be what they call in America complete streets, which is a reallocation of road space, re-evaluating the curb-to-curb width that you've got, looking at what other options you could do with the width that is available, and very often that would include things like dedicated bus lanes so they don't get stuck in traffic, protected bicycle infrastructure, wider footpaths, street furniture, greening the street as well. These are the sorts of things that we're thinking about for the City of Melbourne in terms of road space reallocation, and I think they would apply equally well here in Hobart. As I mentioned before, pricing signals are also important, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail soon. Also doing something to boost the uptake of low-emission vehicles. As I mentioned before, they don't solve all of our transport problems, but they're certainly better than the existing dirty fleet of vehicles that we've got at the moment. And also intersection priority, because intersections are often where conflicts between different modes occur, and intersection priority for green modes enables a faster travel time, and because travel time is one of the core determinants of what mode of transport people will use, it's really important that you're prioritising the modes that you think need to hold a larger share of the transport mix in the future. So the intersections need to reflect those priorities. And so this is just a typical street in Amsterdam, and the city of Utrecht, which is a city about the same size as Hobart, is rolling out thousands of these charging facilities, and members simply get a ID card with some credit attached to it, and you swipe your card and away you go and you charge your vehicle. You can do it overnight, or you can also have the opportunity of rapid charging as well. So this is the sort of thing they're doing in the Netherlands and other countries. This is the sort of thing they're doing in London, road space reallocation. So this used to be a road that looked very similar to some of the larger roads like Macquarie or Davies Street in Hobart, and they're doing massive changes to the street, because they've recognised that as a city's transport, or as a city's challenges and aspirations change, the allocation of road space on those streets also needs to change. So streets that were designed with an allocation of road space in 1926 or 1942, that might have made sense in 1926 or 1942, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in 2018. And what we're starting to see in many European cities is looking at the road space, reassessing whether that reflects their aspirations for the future, and if it doesn't, they change it. And they don't necessarily change it permanently. They would say, let's do a trial for 24 months, see how it goes. We'll do a survey before and after. If we're happy with the result, we'll keep it. If we're not happy with the result, we'll change it, either back to the way it was or some other format. And this is another good example. This is a picture I took in 2014. This is a street in inner city Amsterdam, and I came across an historical picture of the same street in 1968, and it looked like that. It's exactly the same street. The buildings haven't changed. The width of the street is exactly the same. It actually looks wider here than it does there, but it's exactly the same. And I think if you spoke to the people in this street and suggested that you had a plan where you wanted to change it to look like this, I think you'd have a lot of opposition. So that makes me think, well, I wonder how many other streets we've got in places like Hobart or Melbourne or Sydney that are essentially traffic sewers. They either have curbside car parking and moving traffic lanes, or just all moving traffic lanes as clearways, in the hope that you'll somehow relieve congestion by adding additional road volume. And yet, in reality, the most successful use of the space in these dense inner city areas should look more like this. So, Hobart's constantly evolving as a city, and I've certainly seen that from when I was here last to now. And its streets need to evolve in order to support Hobart's ambition for the city that it wants to be. So you're not going to get the sustainable, the green city that you want if the streets still prioritise the most polluting, least efficient, space-efficient form of transport. And I think a nice way to think about transport when you're trying to create a cohesive network that supports the mode of transport that you want to see more of is this idea that Donald Shoup had. Donald Shoup is a professor of car parking, really, at UCLA in the US. And he calls this an old-fashioned approach to transport, but he says that each transport mode has three elements. And I've done this for bikes, but I'll start off quickly with shipping. So shipping has the vehicles, or the ships, the rights of way are the shipping lanes, and the terminal capacity are the ports. Right? That's pretty simple. And so you can also apply it to any other mode of transport. So for cycling, the rights of way are the bike lanes and paths, the vehicles are the bikes themselves, and terminal capacity is the bike parking. So you need to think about all of them. So you wouldn't be doing too well if you just had a tax incentive scheme for the purchase of a bike, because people would have a bike, but then they wouldn't have the rights of way. And if you don't have the rights of way, then that's the weak link in the system. And you'd also need to do something about terminal capacity, although bike parking is a much easier problem to solve than rights of way. But really, it comes down to that allocation of road space. And now, just very quickly in the last 4 minutes or so, I want to talk about disruptive transport technology. And I'm by no means going to be able to do this subject justice, but I'm happy to talk to people afterwards about it. So, autonomous vehicles are going to be here. Some people say it will be 5 years, some people say it will be 20 years. It doesn't really matter. 20 years isn't really that long when you're talking about city planning issues. And this opens up this whole opportunity of being able to use the car as a service rather than something that you own. Because of course, for 96% of the time, a car sits idle somewhere, either outside your house or outside your work. So, considering it's only used 4% of the time, wouldn't it make much more sense just to use it when you need it and then have it operating in the network for other people to use later? So that's where we're headed. But that has the potential to massively exacerbate our congestion issues, and I'm going to quickly go around some of the arguments for that before I leave Jason to finish off this evening's seminar. So this is the autonomous vehicle. People that are too old or too young to currently drive may start to make trips using autonomous vehicles. That may add vehicle kilometres travelled that aren't currently in the mix. You also get a situation where, because you're not paying a driver, the cost of that trip could be comparable to public transport. So people that currently take public transport might forget about public transport and take the door-to-door convenience of an autonomous vehicle, adding to vehicle kilometres travelled again. And you've also got this thing called the Marchetti constant, which is really just the observation that throughout history, for hundreds of years, people have had a travel time budget of around 30 to 40 minutes each way to work and then back from work. But if you can do other things in your car, then you might be willing to accept a travel time budget of 60 minutes or 80 minutes. So if you're adding VKT, you then get an even worse congestion problem than the one we've got already. Not that I think we've necessarily got one yet, but that Marchetti constant is something that is threatened through the autonomous vehicle. And then you've also got the idea of empty miles, which is where, let's say you work in Hobart, but you live 20 k's outside of Hobart. You drive in, or you let your computer drive you in while you're checking your email. Then you get to work, and then you send your car back home because you can get free parking, and it drives itself back. And then at about 4:30, when you're thinking about maybe leaving work, you can summon it back to pick you up in the city again. So you've doubled VKT for nothing. So huge issue, and especially because for half of those kilometres, the person who's calling the car isn't subjected to the congestion that they're imposing on everybody else. It means that they don't really care how bad the congestion is because they're not in the car. And then you've also got this federal government issue, which is the fuel excise. So, 39 cents or so for every litre of petrol. Now, if you start getting electric vehicles en masse, those owners of the Teslas, those $240,000 Teslas, who aren't paying anything in excise, if you start to get 10 or 15 or 20% of the national fleet onto electric vehicles, that could see a significant drop in revenue for the federal government. So there's some of the reasons why I think a road user price is really important. At the moment, we only charge on these roads, these toll roads, but if you had a $1 per kilometre price where these roads were the cheapest, you still paid for them, but they're the roads that are designed to take heavy volumes of traffic. So they should be the cheapest roads because you want to push people out onto those roads, and you want to avoid people driving on these roads, which are the roads that are the public transport priority routes and that are pedestrian priority zones. So you would pay the most on a per kilometre basis to use these roads. So it could be not so much a congestion charge, but a better way of managing the road network to achieve wider city outcomes. That's the sort of thing that I think would be really valuable. And just finally, we also need to think creatively about what sort of infrastructure we need. This is it's called the Hovering. It's just on the outskirts of Eindhoven in the Netherlands. It's not actually bicycle infrastructure. It's for the car. Now, what I mean by that is that the major road underneath this roundabout, this bicycle and pedestrian roundabout, that can carry far more traffic now because it doesn't have traffic lights stopping them underneath the roundabout, because the cyclists and the pedestrians can use this hovering roundabout. So it looks like bike infrastructure, and in a way it is, but it's not really. It's really it's been built there so that cars can move faster without delay on the major road that sits underneath that piece of infrastructure. So we need to think creatively about what we call it bike infrastructure, what we call car infrastructure. It's not always as simple as, well, bikes are using it, so it's bike infrastructure. It only costs 6.5 million euros as well, by the way, which might sound a lot, but compared to some of the costs that we've seen in projects in the last few years, it's actually pretty cheap. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions after Jason's finished his presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elliot. It's my experience that when you start talking about driverless cars, everybody's got a question, so it feels really cruel to tell you that you have to hold on to them until there's another presentation. But our next speaker is Jason Byrne, an internationally recognised professor of urban and environmental planning and human geography, and we're very lucky to have him at the University of Tasmania. Jason and his colleagues are doing a power of work at the moment to try and raise awareness of planning and why it's important in so many of the decisions that are made about the way that we live. His particular research addresses urban political ecologies of green space, climate change adaptation and environmental justice, and he's speaking to us tonight about climate just transport. Thanks, Jess.
Good evening, everybody. I'm really stoked that Elliot went first because he's taking care of a lot of the transport planning questions that I'm sure you have. Let me declare up front, I'm not a transport planner, okay? Let's be really clear about that. I'm a generic planner, a general planner. I worked as a planner in Western Australia for almost a decade before getting tired of the politics and then going and becoming an academic. So I have a background in practice. My specialty is in urban green space and environmental injustice. My wife is trained as a journalist, and like Elliot has done, she told me put the conclusion first. So my synopsis is up front as well. We've got some nice parallels going here, but completely unintentionally. So Tasmania is a highly car-dependent place. We know that, and I'll show you some figures shortly. We also know that the population in Tasmania is concentrated in the state's main cities, in Hobart and Launceston and Devonport. The remainder of the population is quite dispersed throughout Tasmania. Population growth in recent years has been up around 2%, which for Tasmania is pretty extraordinary. And increases in population happen to be associated with increases in traffic congestion. It's hard to show exactly what that level is, but we know that's the case of a very highly car-dependent society. People who come here are going to be highly car-dependent. Transport in Tasmania, as with other states in Australia, is a very strong contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. I'll show you a comparison with Queensland, where I have come from. And it's interesting going from the worst per capita greenhouse gas emitters in Australia, in Queensland, to here, which is significantly less. But there's some parallels. We need to be concerned about some of this. Efforts to tackle traffic congestion can lower greenhouse gas emissions if they're done the right way, which is why Elliot and I are here tonight. And then finally, the solutions. This is the most important take-home message from me. The solutions must be integrated. Okay? They must be integrated. And secondly, they have to be driven by principles, clear principles, to make sure that we stay on track. And finally, they need to be very strategic. Okay, so what I want to be looking at as a frame here is a field called climate justice. I'm not going to labour all this text, I just want to point out two critical elements of climate justice. The first is looking at exposure and vulnerability. Who suffers and who's insulated. And secondly, we need to be paying attention to cities and planning as part of climate justice concerns. And this is why. Even though the impacts of climate change are felt in diverse ways across the planet, our cities are especially vulnerable. Heat waves in Melbourne, for example, can buckle railway lines. This is a railway line buckled from a heat wave in Melbourne not so long ago. In Hobart, we're beginning to see the signals of climate change as well. We're accustomed, not like Queenslanders, we're accustomed to living in a much cooler climate, so when we do have a heat wave here, we feel it more, even though it might not be as high temperatures as elsewhere. As we've seen recently with the Hobart rivulet, our cities are increasingly prone to flooding as well. And the people who get impacted by these kinds of events in climate change tend to be what we would call marginalised and disadvantaged people. So people of colour, low-income earners, people with a disability, people who are very old or very young, who are not mobile, who cannot escape out of harm's way very easily. So I want you to hold this in mind as we begin to talk a little bit about transport. So I want to think about how we can take some of the kinds of thinking from climate change adaptation and apply that to transport planning to look at the intersection, the nexus between congestion and transport. So it's the idea that we can have new ways of acting and cooperating, identifying pathways to reform. The small initiatives that foreshadow transformation are important. This is what Elliot was telling us about when you look at those experimental projects with streets. If we repurpose streets as an experiment and we use it in a slightly different way, they can foreshadow a transformation across an entire city. We can experiment with new pathways. We can think about how we can align the interests of what might otherwise be disparate or competing groups. And we need to work through existing practices. Key here is the idea of having a vision, rolling out innovative design, sharing information, and getting together networks of actors. Okay, it's a lot of text. I'll show you what I mean as we begin to work our way through. So the characteristics of social innovation, as it's called, we're not talking technological innovation here, we're talking social innovation, which is just about changing the way that our relationships work with each other and with institutions. They need to cross scales from the local to the international. They need to foster collective action. They need to also be practice-oriented, how we change the way that we do things, and entail open communication. Okay, so let me give you some examples. If we look at social innovation, it's really about enabling. How do we enable people to act? This builds on the strengths that we might have. I'll show you in a minute what the strengths of Hobart are, I think, from a climate adaptation and transportation perspective. It's also about knowledge transfer, so looking to places like the Netherlands for their innovations and bringing that back to Hobart, and about investment in skills development. So we'll have a look at some of these perspectives. All right, so for congestion busting, I'm not talking about more cars or building wider roads, that kind of stuff, but new modes or switching modes. This is a fully electric bus in North America, for example. Hangzhou in China has just ordered 6,000 electric buses like this year for its city. And I'll show you some pictures of Hangzhou. We can think about that with respect to Hobart. We really should be thinking about here, for congestion busting in Hobart, joined up thinking about socially just outcomes. So not just things that are going to benefit the middle class, but people who are marginalised and vulnerable, and we've got a lot of those people in the northern corridor of Hobart, for example, that they benefit too. And this kind of focus on enabling and strategic thinking. All right, so what I'm getting at here is essentially what we might call design thinking. And I'm only going to take you part of the way through design thinking here. I won't get to the end of it because I don't want to tell you how to do things. We need to discover this, right, through all different kinds of experiments that will unfold in Hobart. But it begins with the ability to empathise with others, to understand what the problem is, to define the problem clearly, and then to come up with ideas. So I'm only going to give you this bit tonight. Afterwards, we might collectively come up with some ideas about how we might prototype some of these initiatives and test them and implement them, like Elliot has shown us examples, and if necessary, come back to redesigning. If there's any architects in the room, I'm sure you're very familiar with design-based thinking. Right, so the second part I want to focus on here then, what are our strengths? How can we work to our strengths and switch challenges to opportunities? We know there's accelerating population growth in Tasmania, and as these images from the Australian Bureau of Statistics from 2014-15 and 2016-17 show, that's occurring primarily around Greater Hobart and in Launceston as well, and we can see those changes really manifesting. Now, if we compare the states in terms of emissions, and my data's nowhere near as fancy as Elliot's, so I'd love to get hold of some of his data, we can see that in Tasmania, we're relatively benign compared to the rest of Australia, like Queensland. But that doesn't mean that we are environmental saints by any stretch. When we look at our energy network, we're lucky we don't have a dirty network like they do in Victoria. We have a fairly clean network. And in this case here, we can see it's mainly hydro, wind and solar that's driving output on this particular day. If we compare Queensland and Tasmania, we get a much more interesting snapshot though. Here we have the top 5 industry sectors in Queensland. This is Australian Bureau of Statistics data, and it's a little old. And we can see that transport is a major source of energy consumption. It's also a major source of emissions. Tasmania, we're much better on electricity generation. Yes, the axes are different. A much bigger scale of energy consumption in Queensland than occurring in Tasmania. But look at transport. It's a really interesting place to focus our thinking. When we look at Australian transport emissions, and again this only goes up to 2010, we see that signature that Elliot was talking about, cars being a major component of Australian transport emissions. This is because cars are inefficient. Now I'm going to hammer you with this slide because Elliot's done something similar. He's showing you similar images. If we look at all the people sitting on this road and put them together, they fit very neatly on the bus and they don't take up anywhere near as much space as if they're all driving cars separately. Now this is a setup, right? This is a staged image. Some of you who are big proponents of individual car driving will be horrified by this, I'm sure. Buses are the most fuel-efficient mode of transportation. Significantly more fuel-efficient than heavy rail and light rail, although this is old data, and Elliot can perhaps correct me with some of this data as they apply to Australia. Secondly, when we look at construction costs and operating costs, we get an interesting kind of perspective here. This is data from the US, from Berkeley. But buses operating at peak hour, at peak efficiency, consume much less electricity than those operating at off-peak. So we want to be essentially designing our buses in a way that they're working better. And here we've got a comparison with 737s, and it starts to get a bit horrific when you look at SUVs being not too far away from that. And here's Elliot's point. If we embark on building a superhighway, an e-car superhighway here in Tasmania, like they've done in Queensland, right at the coast of Queensland, from the Gold Coast to Cairns, it's in operation right now, all we're going to do is put more cars on the road. We won't solve the problem of congestion. Okay, so here's the last part of what I want you to think about. How does planning come into this? How does the way we design and plan our cities give us better environmental outcomes in terms of lower carbon emissions and reducing congestion issues? Public transport requires density, certainly not on the scale of this kind of density, but it does require density. We need to make two-way trips cost effective. And the good thing about public transport is it promotes walking and healthy lifestyles. When you walk to the bus stop and you walk back from the bus stop, or when you walk to the train, you're being physically active. You're building exercise into your daily activities. Right. Density for public transport, though, does not mean skyscrapers. So if you're in Hobart and you're worried about protecting the heritage we have here, take a big deep breath. It's not a problem. We don't need to emulate the Gold Coast to get the kind of density that we need. So this is in South America, a city that's very famous for its fast rapid transit. This is in Europe, this is Amsterdam. Elliot's probably familiar with this part of Amsterdam. So this is the kind of scale we're talking about, 5 to 7 story development. A mix of different tenures, housing types, and different housing affordability ranges. So renters versus private ownership, cheap versus more expensive. Having a 10 to 15 minute walk to the nearest transport corridor, and having extensive and generous green spaces. You saw the image from Elliot, when we can repurpose streets, we can, if you live in Queensland, cool cities. Or if you're living in Victoria, you can cool the city. Here, we can also insulate the city with green space to make them warmer at night. Now, this is Hangzhou in China. This is the image I wanted to show you about density. So here's that 5 to 7 story development that they've been doing in China. They're not all living in these massive skyscrapers. This is my wife's city. You can see a mix of development here between shopfront retail and restaurants and medical practices, and then people living up above. You can tell by the washing, right? Right, so we have density in Hobart. That's great for us. This is from the Land Information System of Tasmania. You can see in the densest parts of Hobart, we have 1,400 to 2,000 people per square kilometre. Now, how does this compare with other cities in Australia? Well, Sydney, 16,000 people per square kilometre in the densest parts. Melbourne even higher, 19,000. Brisbane, 6,000. So not as high densities. You might immediately think, well, how can we possibly sustain an effective public transport system if we don't have that level of density? And the answer is we already had one in the past, and we got rid of it. We had trams, and we had trains, and we had trolley buses that were working very well in Tasmania, at the kinds of scale of density that we have in Hobart, and we got rid of them. And here's that image that Elliot wanted to show you. If we go back in time a bit further from where he was looking at in the 70s, and you push it all the way back further, we can see that huge transformation that was happening in Australia post-war, where the car became king and where rail and bus patronage declined significantly. The good news is we can take this fish diagram and you can start to see the downturn here and a slight upkick here. We can join the head of the fish together, hopefully very soon, and start to even out that mode share. Alright, so Hobart is Tasmania's largest destination for journey to work travel. This is an important point. When we look at the data from Journey to Work surveys in Hobart, what we can see is people are coming in from outer areas by car as a driver or a passenger. This is Greater Hobart, getting to work. And if it's Hobart, the city of Hobart itself, a slightly smaller percentage, a much bigger increase percentage in walking. Lots of people walk to work here in Hobart. That's quite unique. But we still have this car dominance. And how do we compare to the rest of Australia? Well, not so good. Right, so here's the take-home message as we begin to wrap up this presentation. We need to disincentivise some private car use. Now, I'm not being a public transport Nazi here, saying that everybody has to take public transport. I'm not saying you can't drive your car. What I'm saying is we need to disincentivise some parts of car use. We need to make public transport work better, and to do that we have to increase ridership. To increase ridership, it must be convenient. It must be frequent, reliable, comfortable and safe, and we must be able to get from one place to another easily. So that might mean dropping the kids off to school on the way to work on, for example, bus rapid transit, hopping off the bus, dropping the kids, getting back on the bus, going and doing some shopping, and then on the bus one last time to get to work. It has to be as easy as catching a car. And we can do this. We know that cities around the world already do this. Right, so what we need essentially in Hobart is joined up thinking. We have to have this modal shift, and we have to have more efficient land use to lower greenhouse gas emissions, to promote healthier lifestyles, to reduce some of the air quality issues that we have during peak congestion, and to give us better use of time. It's a complete waste of time to be sitting behind the wheel of a car. Not only does it make your waistline bigger and predispose you to poor mental health outcomes like anxiety and stress and feeling socially isolated, but it has economic impacts as well. Cities with good public transport systems are economically much more efficient. Right, so just to wrap up, we need to think about different kinds of innovation, not just technological innovation, but regulatory innovation, innovation in governance, innovation in the way we exchange information, innovation in the way we make policies. And we need to think about, as Pastiani and others tell us, about what are the enabling factors that will help us get beyond the congestion problem we have right now. And these mean things like organisational champions. I'm sure you know it already, it's kind of common sense, but when you have a champion in your organisation, whether it's a mayor showing leadership in the city, whether it's a vice-chancellor, like our new vice-chancellor at University of Tasmania, who can galvanise action and provide leadership, they become a lightning rod for change. So we need effective leadership. We also need good timing, and it's really good timing now in Tasmania, given the kinds of congestion problems we're seeing, given the increase in housing prices. The timing's never going to be better than now to start to transform and move away from these congestion issues. We need to have market and policy signals. Congestion represents a market failure, really. I'm sure that Elliot would agree with that. So we need to have signals, pricing signals, that help us understand how we really are subsidising car use to our detriment. So I'm going to leave you with some provocative ideas. I'm not going to tell you what I think all the solutions are. These really are just provocations, and we might think about it as a tree. The low-hanging fruit, the easy-to-get stuff, the kind of middle branches that are a little bit harder, either politically or economically. Maybe they're not politically palatable. Maybe we don't have the technology yet. And then the kind of top of the tree, harder still. So here's a provocation. What if we were to enforce the clearways here in Hobart? I don't know how many times you've been driving around the city, but I've lived in Los Angeles before. If you had the behaviour here that happens in Los Angeles, we wouldn't have as much of a problem. Cars would simply get towed if they were parking in a clearway. That means we've got space for buses. We should be upgrading our cycleways, making cycling much easier. We need to be upgrading our public transport services. Now, this is not the kind of fancy bell and whistle thing like having USB rechargers in the back of the bus. That's not really going to change much. We need to rethink public transport, make it a true network. If we have networks of public transport across the city, buses that are operating every 10 minutes, you don't have to worry about a timetable. You can drop your kids off at kindy, you can go do the shopping, you can hop back on the bus because changing between buses is easy. Secondly, we need to make the transfer much easier as well. Free transfer. Many cities around the world do this. Free transfer between one bus and the next within a time period. Let's say it's 2 or 3 hours. We should be thinking about infill development. There's a lot of wasted space in the heart of Hobart. A lot of wasted space. It's the only city I can think of where you've got a major Bunnings equivalent downtown in the heart of the city selling hardware, when that could be mixed-use development apartments. And we could be doing other kinds of crazy things like value capture. If we put in bus rapid transit or a light rail system, we could take the additional revenue that comes from those properties that benefit from the property value increase and use that to partly fund bus rapid transit. That's called value capture. Finally, we might want to do some more controversial things like rent control on transit corridors, and I'll show you why. If we're emulating cities like Brisbane with its metro, bus rapid transit, this is a bus, not a train, or Freiburg with its light rail system and mixed-use development, or Singapore, we're going to have to watch out for gentrification, because places like Glenorchy and Bridgewater are suddenly going to be very desirable. They're nice and close to the city. You could easily hop on and off a rapid transit system, get to work. Those property values will increase. And the people at the moment who have shelter that's affordable will suddenly find themselves being displaced to the periphery of the city. And that's a big problem. So we want to discourage that displacement by maybe having things like rent control. We want to avoid housing stress and health impacts and social isolation and long commutes and loneliness that can occur if we don't control for that gentrification. So we'll open the room up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. If I can get Elliot to just come back up to you. No, I think it'll be okay. Oh, actually, Michael, do they need the mics on to be caught?
Should be fine.
We can just raise voices.
So if tonight's event was the design thinking table, we are now in the ideate phase. So I'll invite you to ask some questions or open for discussion, anything of either of the speakers. Chris?
To Jason, you briefly mentioned governance structures. It seems to me that there's a vacuum in democracy. Sorry? My bad. Sorry, there seems to be a vacuum in adequate democracy, and as far as I can see, the biggest financial injection and the biggest impact on transport happens as a result of politics and pork barrelling at elections and so forth. And so when the rare amount of money that suddenly is injected into the system gets spent on things where there's no conversation, all of a sudden we find that there's a whole heap of money allocated for the northern suburbs or something like that, the highway going out there. This seems to me, all of these good ideas seem to be subsumed in this problem of lack of democratic engagement with transport planning.
Right, that's an easy question. So I think it's a really good one, Chris. To answer it as best as I can, I think we need institutional reform. So in Hobart, that would be a single transit agency responsible, for example, for rolling out the network, rather than the kind of semi-private system that we have at the moment with Metro Tasmania. But if we scale up, remember I said scale was really important here, we need to have a federal government that's thinking about cities and taking cities seriously. And we're beginning to see that, right? The city deals, these kind of things. Malcolm Turnbull is a fan of rail, unlike Tony Abbott, so that's kind of good news for people who are fans of rail. The last time we had a federal government that was taking cities seriously was Gough Whitlam with the Department of Urban and Regional Development, right? Back in the 1970s. And that's when we saw some of these innovations beginning to occur. We also had a little kind of dalliance with Labor in the early 90s, 1992, with Building Better Cities program, where other Australian cities were quite successful in getting metro scale rail, like Perth and Brisbane, for example. The Gold Coast has taken advantage of this shifting mindset at a national level to roll out light rail without pork barrelling. It's a politically conservative seat. It doesn't deserve any special treatment because it's about as liberal friendly as you can get. But they made a compelling argument that the city needed to move away from its car dependence and start to embrace alternative modes of transport. And the Gold Coast is a real success story. It saw a 25% increase in public transit patronage immediately after the deployment of the light rail. And that's increasing still. From a mayor who was quite sceptical at the time that it was being rolled out to now having stage 3 of the light rail system occurring. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily all die about pork barrelling in election times. I think that if we start to get that alignment and that leadership, the institutional innovation, we can see a difference. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yep. Is this on? Yes. I picked up on the word de-incentivise, and I thought to myself, there's that old saying, if you've got them by the watsits, their hearts and minds will follow. The problem with Hobart, of course, is that there's no way of getting around it, so people go through it. But it seems to me that part of what we're actually looking at is in some way or another controlling traffic coming into the city or around or through the city, and in some way or another providing alternatives to that. You've got, I think it's Hong Kong, is it, where you have odds and evens, and then in London you have the congestion charge. And recently I was listening to something that was indicating that one of the best solutions is not to have parking in the city. I don't know whether anybody heard that. Would you like to respond to those? Oh, the other thing was that you seem to have a difference, the two of you. You were talking about solving congestion is not an issue, and yet, Jason, you were talking to a large extent about solving congestion, so that's an interesting dilemma, I think. Thank you.
Do you want to take that? Yeah. So, I agree with you. The issue of parking and putting a cap on parking in central city areas can be a very effective way in suppressing the amount of car traffic that you have in a city. So if the city collectively decides that it wants to have less car traffic in the central core of the city, then putting a car parking maximum on new developments and limiting the amount of car parking available in the city is a good way of reducing the attractiveness of travelling to the city by car. So I agree with you on that. One of the, and I don't know enough about the geography of the network to know whether there are opportunities for still moving through this area of Tasmania without going through central Hobart, but I'm getting a few nods there, so maybe I'll just stop right there.
Bob will tell you about that.
Okay, but what I will say, this isn't necessarily directly related to Hobart, but one of the new ways of thinking about managing traffic in central city areas is doing what they trialled in a place in the north of the Netherlands, in Groningen, in the 1970s, which is where you can get to every property address by car in the central city area, but they divided the city into quadrants, and you can't travel from one to the other without going back out into a ring road and going around again. So it really cuts central city traffic out, but still allows cars to access the properties that they need to access, just doesn't encourage through traffic. But I can appreciate that that wouldn't work in Hobart if the geography isn't there to support it.
So it's a good question. The community travel surveys that have been done recently in Hobart, the Journey to Work surveys, show that there is a very clear amount of traffic that's coming from outlying Hobart just into Hobart, not cross-town traffic. So this is people who are simply driving their car to work, working and then driving their car back home. That's really the source of our congestion problem at the moment, which is why I'm suggesting we need to switch to public transport. So if you do what Brisbane did and remove a whole heap of the car parks and convert them into buildings, that makes immediately a price signature, a demand-supply price signature becomes more expensive. When you're paying $20, $25 an hour for parking, you might rethink travelling into the city. But secondly, you might also do what Singapore has been doing since the 1970s, and that's congestion charging. They're a leader in the world, right? And that's been followed and emulated in different ways by Stockholm and London and other places. But here's the key, and I'm sure some people in the audience would agree with me here, is that these charges can be highly regressive if you're car dependent. Okay, so if you're living in an outer suburban area and there's no public transit system that you can use, and you're then being forced into your car and then have to drive to the city, you are bearing a huge cost that other people who live in the inner ring don't have to pay because they can afford to live in that desirable inner ring. So at the same time as we send these price signals, we also have to roll out effective public transport to those outer suburban areas first. Okay, those feeder routes need to be the first things that we're doing.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andrew, and I have to admit two things at the start and apologise for them. First, I'm a Queenslander, and second, I'm a political hack. So I guess I'm taking the first question and continue a bit about the big P word politics, because it seems to me that this is a political process, and that therefore we need to talk about it. Because it also seems to me that there are two things to be done here, both of which are incredibly controversial, if not unpopular. The first is building much more dense housing in the inner city, where a bunch of rich people live with their massive mortgages and potential retirement pension schemes. And the second is stop paying people who drive huge amounts of money and start paying people who don't drive huge amounts of money. Unfortunately, more people drive than don't, which means that there's a much larger constituency of people who do. And essentially what we're asking people to do, a political party to do, is do something that's very unpopular. And even in places where, like Paris, where there's a large constituency of people who do actually take the public transport, they've been unable to, for instance, build high density. It's not done. In places like London, where also public transport is very popular, the congestion charge is incredibly unpopular. So it seems to me that cities like Hobart, where 90% of people drive, or Brisbane, where 90% of people drive, this is a big problem. How the hell do we get around it?
Sure. So the modal share for car is about 80% journey to work, so fairly high. Walking is also very high in Hobart. So there's a couple of things. Hobart's different to Brisbane or the Gold Coast. It has a lot of surplus land in the city that's not heritage buildings, that's just vacant old car yards. They already knocked down the heritage buildings, unfortunately, there in the 50s and 60s, and is vacant parking lots, and it's perfect for this kind of inner city development. What we don't want to see is the Brisbane model of very tall skyscrapers that destroy the inner city skyline, which is why I showed you Hangzhou, right, as a model, that 5 to 7 story Paris, Copenhagen, Amsterdam's scale of density. The political palatability is a really good question, and I'm going to hospital hand pass to Elliot on this one with a prompt. So in Amsterdam, what drove their reforms was something called Kindermord, and I'll let Elliot explain what that means. It was a force that the politicians could not stand against. And I think if we can find a similar point of leverage here, you'll actually be able to enrol, like I said, these different interests, enrol them to achieve that kind of purpose.
Thanks, Jason. So Kindermord translates to stop the child murder, and it occurred in the Netherlands in the early 1970s when there was an astronomical rise in the number of children that had died on the roads because the Netherlands, like many countries, were accumulating wealth and using that wealth to purchase cars, but they didn't really have a framework for road safety. And so I think especially when a journalist's child was killed, it ignited a mass movement, and they had huge demonstrations where the centre of the city had thousands of people that all just lay down on the ground and demonstrated that they needed a better system. And that was really the birth of what they now call sustainable safety, which is recognising the fallibility of a road user, and it created what's also known in some circles as the safe systems approach, which makes for a more forgiving road network and way in which a mistake doesn't result in death. So now the standard speed in Amsterdam and other parts of the Netherlands is 30 kilometres an hour. In some residential streets it's 15 kilometres an hour, and that's for bikes as well as cars. And I think they had four children died last year in the Netherlands, so a massive turnaround in the number of deaths. But the other thing I wanted to say was in regards to congestion charging. And in the analysis that's been done by others on the different systems that operate around the world, what they've come out as a core theme of it is that the pain is in the change. It's talking about it is painful, and it's the day that you switch on the congestion charge is a bit nerve-wracking. Then after that, a lot of the people that said it wasn't going to work and they don't want it, get over it, and they realise that there are some benefits in terms of 20% reduction in congestion in London, for instance. The only problem they had in London, really, on the first day was that the buses started running ahead of schedule, and they had to stop the buses so that they weren't turning up at their stops early. So I think the big thing from the researchers that have looked at this is the pain is in the change. It's talking about, it's the same with road space reallocation and saying, well, that lane of curbside car parking is now going to be a wider footpath than a protected bike lane. The pain is in the change. You get over that, and then you don't have the problems that a lot of people anticipate. There's a lot of hysteria about that sort of stuff, but when you actually do it, it's never as bad as people say. The other point on density is that I think density is received a bad name in part because of some of the developments that have occurred, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, where you get 40 or 50-storey buildings and these wind tunnels and the shadowing that you get, and also no street-level activation, really bad examples. The sort of density that I think we could probably benefit from, especially in a city that is, to my mind at least, Hobart has retained its human scale in a way that a lot of the mainland cities have really lost that. I think the idea of gentle density would work well in Hobart, where 4 or 5-storey buildings, the people at the very top of the building still have a strong connection with the people at the ground level, whereas when you go to 13, 14, 15 stories or more, you lose that connection and a lot of the benefits that come from density are lost. So 4 or 5 stories, I think, would really benefit Hobart in a way that would be nice for people to live in, but also for the people that aren't living, that are walking past those buildings, still create a nice human feel and something that I think would benefit not just the livability of Hobart, but also the transport opportunities and giving people housing in areas with better transit and better access to jobs and services.
There was one problem with London congestion charge, wasn't there? And that was that Uber were exempt.
I did not realise that.
Yeah, so this kind of car sharing was exempt, and so what happened was we saw a switch from public transport to Uber, and that has undermined the efficacy of the London congestion charge. They're in the process of fixing it at the moment. They realised all of a sudden we've got a problem. But that's one issue.
Apparently the US Embassy also refused to pay the charge as well. They thought they were exempt.
Woolworths knows all about the rate of change.
Yeah.
Takes 10 days.
Bob Cotgrove, just a quick comment. As you mentioned, the congestion charging in London. It's not a congestion charge, it's an entry fee into central London. It started at £5, it's now about £20. The issue with Uber was exempt just as taxis were exempt. The issue with Uber relates to entirely different matters, and that's the problems with attacks on passengers by drivers and vice versa. So please don't confuse that with public transport. I would say that I've been...
Confused the question with a comment, have you?
Sorry, yes. Thank you. I've been attending these sort of sessions because I'm interested in urban transport and the environment. I'm an environmental economist for 50 years. The personnel have changed, but the issues remain the same. Higher densities, public transport, stop people using cars, and all of that sort of thing. Jason mentioned that we got rid of trams and trolley buses in Hobart. The reason for that was that when suburban trains stopped functioning in the 1970s, the fare was only 13 cents in the dollar of operating costs. There was a total lack of money for investment or improvements. People stopped using trains just as people stopped using trolley buses. The reason for that, of course, is that as incomes increased, they bought cars, and they were able, as a result of car ownership, to move into the suburbs where they could have larger houses, space for the kids to play in, a more active, physically and socially active lives. Jason, you mentioned about higher densities coming back into the city. The median price of houses in Battery Point, the suburb behind us, which is a mix of working class, or used to be a mix of working class as well as mansions, is over $1 million. And the same applies in South Hobart, West Hobart, and so on. Throughout both of your talks, you only talked about the costs of environmental pollution, which is coming down, of course, as cars become more efficient. You only talk about the journey to work. You didn't talk about any other activities that people do. You concentrated purely on costs. You totally ignored the vast benefits that people get from car ownership and car use.
Is there a question there at all, Bob?
Well, how can you justify saying that higher densities are better? You talked about the effects of pricing.
No, seriously, Bob, let him answer.
So, Bob, you can lecture the whole audience and hold your character for us or not.
Point. Is that what you're saying?
No, so please don't put words in my mouth. And if you've been paying attention, you would have heard that we talked about the need for us to have bus transit systems where interchange is easy, right? I'm not advocating $1 million solutions in central Hobart. What I'm advocating is affordable housing, a mix of densities, the kind of solutions we've seen that work in Amsterdam, the solutions that we've seen that work in Adelaide. So I think, you know, we could go backwards and forwards all night, and I'm sure you would love to. I don't want to hold the audience captive. Would you like to make a comment as well? Or?
I was just a bit surprised about the comment about living more active, physically active and socially active lives, because most of the research that I've looked at from public health researchers has been that suburban, car-dependent, car-orientated lifestyle has actually resulted in a net reduction in physical activity, and that the streets that have a mix of transport options, you're more likely to know your neighbours than if you live in a suburb that has a much higher level of car use. So that social, well, Appleyard 1981 is the study if you want to look up. So I was a bit surprised by that. But the other point is that drop in patronage also came about through a massive increase in the level of service for motor vehicles. So people don't make transport decisions in isolation. They weigh up the pros and cons of different transport options and then choose the mode that makes the most sense for that particular trip. And I'm sorry if I wasn't clear that I wasn't saying that cars are bad and no one should drive them. I was saying they serve a purpose, and it's picking the right mode for the right trip. That's important. So if you're going to IKEA to pick up a kid's bunk bed, use a car. If you're going to pick up a litre of milk or some bread, maybe walk or ride a bike. So it's about picking the right mode for the right trip, not only use public transport and throw away your car keys.
Richard Atkinson, I'm a councillor on Kimbra Council and for the benefit of non-Hobart people. Kimbra's suburbs south of Hobart, and we've got suburbs that used to be shacks and seaside towns that are now dormitory suburbs for Hobart, and so we've got a lot of people that drive to the city, and one of the problems is the rapid expansion of those suburbs, and they've been done in a very car-centric way, and you know that people aren't paying the real full cost of operating that car. You know, lots of infrastructure has been provided so that it appears to be the cheap option. I'm glad you're talking about land use planning, so I think that's critical in this, but we have existing land use planning, existing modes of land use that make it very difficult to provide public transport. Metro say that they can't afford to put buses into some of those areas. They'll do it, maybe a couple of buses at peak hour. And then the smaller towns further out, like Margate or Snow, which are now becoming dormitories for Hobart, because it's where people can afford to live, only have a couple of buses a day. So those people haven't got an option, and yet they're, if you make it harder for them to park in Hobart, as you say, it imposes a penalty on them and they don't have the option. I'm wondering what your ideas are for that. It's the last mile, but it's also sometimes the last 5 or 10 miles. What could we do for those people? Because we can't rapidly densify their suburbs and make them effective for, it's a legacy of the past 30 years of suburban development. What are your suggestions?
Yes, excellent question. Do you mind if I go first? So I kind of preempted this by giving you some references for material that I drew on today. You're welcome to take a photo if you want to. The late Paul Mees, who was a transport planner in Melbourne, has shown that public transport can be effective at low density. One of the problems is, if we're running the same size bus through low density suburbs as what we are in the inner city, the bus is going to be empty, and so the economics won't stack up. In Hong Kong, I don't know if anyone's been to Hong Kong before. Anyone taken one of those little coaster buses in Hong Kong? You feel like you're taking your life into your own hands, but they operate just like Toyota coaster buses in the lower density outlying areas as feeder routes into a higher speed transport mode. So you can have the ability to catch public transport still quite effectively in that last mile. Go down to the portal, whether it's bus rapid transit or light rail, and you get into the city really easily, again maybe making a transfer to heavy rail. So we could do that kind of stuff here, effectively setting up feeder routes and borrowing an idea from Elliot. This may be driverless buses. So in Ipswich at the moment, they're trialling driverless buses which have lower numbers of people, 8 to 12 people. They've trialled them in Perth as well, haven't they? And they would enable you to take advantage of that last quarter mile or mile. If you link it to a smartphone, you'd be able to dial up the bus as needed, right? And it can take you to the higher frequency route and connect up there. Do you have a comment?
I just wanted to say, look, there are no silver bullets for that issue, and that's an issue that's not unique to Hobart, as you know. In other countries, they wouldn't allow that sort of expansion of the city without also providing suitable transport options so that people weren't dependent on the car. And to me, that it would be nice to have a situation like that here, because we do end up exacerbating our transport problems. I know that doesn't necessarily give you much of a solution. Some short-term things that could help is the idea of co-working office hubs, where a lot of people live in a house where it's not really suitable for them to work at home. So they might have young kids, or they might not have dedicated space that they're able to work in that satisfies the health and safety requirements of the organisation that they work for. But creating small-scale work hubs, community-based, so it might be attached to a library, let's say, some sort of neighbourhood space where you have high-speed internet and you have desks that are available for people to use. Obviously, they'll still need to come back to their employer, which might be centrally city located, but even if it's just 1 or 2 days a week, that's still a rapid reduction in the amount of vehicle kilometres travelled that they're making. It's something that could be rolled out within months. So that's one option. The other option, I know this isn't a particularly sexy or popular option at the moment, but the idea of sharing the ride with people that live in the same postcode as you and work in the same postcode, using a web-based tool to link up people together in almost like an Airbnb way, where you can see a picture of the person you're going to be sharing a ride with. They have a star rating, so if they're a creep, you're going to know about it before you get in the car with them. That sort of thing can help to at least share the ride, so that if you have 2 people going in the same place, it's like shaving the amount of VKT off that trip. So there's some just short-term things that don't really require any infrastructure other than digital infrastructure, really, that could work. But then in the longer term, the idea of rapid transit linked to cycling infrastructure can help. So you can increase the catchment of a public transport hub by a factor of 15 if people can ride easily to that public transport hub. So people might live beyond a comfortable walk from it, but they live within a comfortable ride from that and then get them directly into the city. But that also requires an increase in public transport spending, and there might not necessarily be an appetite right now from the government to do that, but that's something that I think in the long term would be required if we're looking at making these long trips from what an area that used to really be considered outside of Hobart and now effectively is in the wider economic catchment of Hobart as a city.
So Kingsborough are working with park and ride facilities at the moment as well, right? So if they're done the right way, you can kind of integrate that option where people can share.
No, it's actually paying for it.
No, not yet.
Well, yeah, it's a long time.
All right, unfortunately, we're running out of time for one more quick question, and then I'll ask Peter to sum up.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you. Thanks for the great talks. Just a question, really, a comment from you both, if you wouldn't mind. We've currently got the city deal supposedly being negotiated behind the scenes, and something's going to pop out maybe at the other end of this year. From the research that I've seen, Tasmania has the lowest per capita spend on public transport of all the states and territories, and not just by a little bit, but by a massive amount. So the per capita spend on public transport, the reason we've got poor public transport is because we just aren't not spending the money, and even a small increase, I think, would be noticed because we've got a fairly small population. do you think that the federal government should make any city deal contingent on the state government spending more money on public transport? Probably Dorothy Dixer, but I mean, how do we actually try and get that spending up from the state government? And do you think there's any appetite at the federal level to actually really push for a much more, like across the states, having a much more similar level of spending per capita on public transport?
I can't, I think that is more of a comment than a question, but I tend to agree with you. I think there needs to be much more money spent on public transport, especially after learning that Tasmania has the lowest spending out of any, and per capita I imagine, than any other Australian state. One thing that they do, and I know that I've spoken a lot about the Netherlands tonight, but one thing that they do there is they get funding from the federal government, and it goes to the provincial government, which is essentially the equivalent of the states, in conjunction with local governments to decide on how to spend their transport money. And when you do it like that, you very often get a much stronger mix, or a much higher component of that money, of that proportion, going to public transport than when you have things that are just dedicated at a very high level, and they only look at roads of national significance is generally how Commonwealth start coming to the table when it comes to transport, or they look really only at freight, because we have this unusual system where the transport minister is from the National Party, and the National Party very often are concerned more with getting produce to ports than they are about getting people to jobs or to the dentist or whatever it happens to be. So I think we need to change the framework so that it's much more, the funding is much more at a local level, and I think when you get that, you'll start to get decisions that favour much more spending on public transport rather than just major freeways to ports, which is what very often happens now.
You did a good job. I don't need to answer that.
Excellent. Right, well, if I can get you all to join me in thanking our two speakers. We will make their presentations available on our website for anyone who needs to peruse the reference list in more detail. I'm now going to invite Peter Boyer just to come up and do a bit of a wrap up on what we've heard and where to from here.
Well, that's a bit of a tall order, I reckon, a wrap up on what we've heard and where we go from here, because, there's for a start, we've had some two excellent presentations covering I think in a very short space of time, covering the full gamut of what's required. I suppose in a nutshell, we can say we've got three related issues here. Public transport, it seems to be the one that has attracted perhaps most of the conversation. Disincentivise, not a word I like, but a discouragement for people to drive cars. And the question of land use planning and gentle density, 4 to 5 story buildings. I don't suppose anyone who came here tonight who's thought about this issue would think that these are particularly new aspects of transport planning, but I think we're getting very close to an understanding of those amongst those who, such as our two speakers and many people in this room, who have thought a lot about the way their city works. I guess we're reaching a point where things are starting to come together, threads are starting to come together. We're reaching a general understanding about urban density, about congestion, about the use of public facilities, and about land use planning. As to where we go from here, I think the fundamental issue that we're having to face is the gap between local government. We've got local government representatives here tonight, thank you, and they took part in the questions, and other levels of government. How we can cross that huge divide, I have yet to work out. I do not know, and I think that is the biggest challenge facing us. We need members of Parliament at state and federal level to start taking this seriously. And as I think it was Elliot pointed out, or was it Jason, that the last serious federal attempt to come to grips with this problem was in the 1970s. Enough said. So where we go from here, I trust there'll be something coming out of this. I hope that this is going to encourage further discussions around this, because the question is not going to go away, the issue is not going to go away, and it has to be dealt with not just on a Hobart-wide level, that is Greater Hobart, but a statewide and a national level. I don't think there's anything more I can add to that. Thanks, Jess, and thank you very much for coming along. It's great to see so many people and such a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, the call for further discussion is a very nice segue into me telling you that if you haven't already signed up for our mailing list, you can do that and be part of any future events or future discussion that we have. There's also a bowl outside for donations, because Climate Tas doesn't have any funding, and to put events like this on does cost money, so if any contribution you can make would be greatly appreciated. As we've heard, it's a really complicated issue. The fact that it hasn't been dealt with well since the 70s is an indication of how hard the questions are, but I do think it's critical that we do look at it in an integrated way and recognise that there are a lot of threads and we need to do better work to kind of bring those together. Thank you very much to the speakers, thank you to Peter, thank you to all for coming, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.